We are starting the book of 2 Samuel. So we're in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. And before we get into the message of the David story, and from this point forward, it's the David story. It has been the Samuel, David, Saul story, but now it's just David's story, and his kids then eventually here too. But before we get into chapter 1 of 2 Samuel this morning, I want to talk really quickly, and this is applicable, to this epidemic, I would say, of depression. I want to talk about depression for a second. It is, all just Google what depression statistics in every single website. There's nowhere, anywhere where you can find anybody saying depression is going down, things are getting better, there's less anxious people, there's less depressed people than they used to be. No, it's actually the exact opposite. Everybody seems to agree that depression, anxiety, stress is going up, up, up all over the place. And I, just to be honest with you, put all my cards out on the table, there's a part of me that looks at that and says, well, you know what? Things have always been bad. People have always had difficult times, whatever. Let's just stop focusing on it. It's not that big a deal. But when suicide rates are going up and when actual things are happening, it's not just someone saying, well, things are actually happening. And I believe that depression is on the rise. I have no doubt about that. And this morning, we are going to tackle one of the reasons, I believe, why that is the case, why depression, anxiety are going up. So I've got a couple of different reasons here. This is not an exhaustive list, and I'm not an expert on depression. I'm not a psychologist or anything like that. I do listen to Jordan Peterson's podcast, so I don't know if that helps. But I've got some reasons, and then the last one is going to be the one we're going to focus on today. But I think they're worth mentioning, and maybe it'll be helpful. I would say that the biggest culprit, or one of the biggest culprits, or the first one that I'm going to mention, is comparison. I think comparison is always a trap. I think comparison to other people, good and bad, will always cause depression, right? I will look at you and I will compare myself to you, and I will either then decide that I'm better than you, and pride will puff up, which is, going to cause me to be depressed because I'm not supposed to live that way. Or I'm always looking at people and saying, oh, they have it so much better than I do. And obviously social media, the rise of social media has exacerbated this, incredibly. All day, every day, right? Kids, teenagers, young people, 20-somethings, 30-somethings, 40-somethings, 50-somethings are scrolling, and it's just like, oh, well, they're doing this, and they're doing this, and they're doing this, and they look like this, and they sound like this, and they have this much money, and they have all, and it's almost like someone said, I'm going to create an app on a phone that's going to cause people to be depressed and anxious. It's almost like that was their goal going into it. That's how much it is. And not only that, but it's also creating a fake connection. We need real connection. We need to look people in the eyes, shake their hands, give them hugs. We need to sit across from the table with people and eat with people and have conversations, real conversations with flesh and blood people. And yet we have this fake connection that's happening, right? I know often relationships, like Brett and Katie, you guys met online, right? But it's not like you said, well, we're going to be married online, right? There came a point where we actually have to meet one another, And so I think that we're creating all sorts of fake connections and comparison, and I think that is causing lots of problems when it comes to that. I know that I struggle with that myself. I don't really scroll through social media. I unfollowed everybody. So my social media feed, in fact, I get alerts from Facebook that says something is wrong with your feed. Like Facebook will tell me something's not right. It's because I have 800 friends and follow none of them. But they don't understand what I'm doing. So there's that. I would say another one is just the glut of entertainment options that we have today are designed to draw us into things that are quite frankly ungodly, right? I could stay up all night and watch TV in a way that I couldn't stay up all night and read my Bible, and that's just the truth, right? I read my Bible, I'm going to get tired, but if there's just this series on Netflix or something that's just lit, right, and I'm just going to get locked in, and then all of a sudden, you don't like that word? Is that not good? Are the kids saying lit nowadays? I don't know what they're saying. I try to keep up, but I just can't, I've heard some of them. I can stay up and I can scroll my phone for hours when I'm still tired. I can be playing a video game for hours and it can keep me awake. And I think this oversaturation of entertainment is making us depressed. I really, really believe this. And not only that, but it's not like it's all good stuff either that we're watching and listening to and playing, right? It's mostly sin-based. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I find the obsession with murder disturbing. I do. There are endless hours of documentaries, real crime documentaries, where you can get into the psyche of all of these serial killers and stuff. And I'm like, why are we so obsessed with this? What is it? Is this quality contemplation? Is this something that I ought to be spending my time on? I don't know that it is, And I have decided in myself, and they're super compelling. Let me just say, they're really well done. Like Erica and I watched the one that's really popular, the Making a Murderer one. And it sucked us in. I'm not going to lie. Like, we were like, well, we're just watching this for the rest of the day. And we watched the whole thing. And afterwards, am I closer to God because of it? No, not at all. Can I make a difference in this person's life? No, I can't. This is just gross entertainment. And I don't think it's good for us. Isaiah chapter 26, this is it. Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3 says, "You will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you." When I talk to some people and they sit down in my office and they say, "I'm dealing with depression," and I say, "Tell me about your day-to-day day. What does your week look like? How are you spending your time?" And I find out that they're playing video games for hours on end, that they're on social media for hours on end, that they stay up all night, late watching television and doing all of this stuff, and their whole life is just consuming all of this stuff. I say, yeah, I would be depressed too. I would be dealing with all sorts of stuff if that's how I spent my time. I choose not to spend my time that way, right? And that's the solution. It doesn't mean you're going to do it, but that's one of the issues, I think. And I'm not going to hit everything that I can think of, but I would say another one is I don't think we're eating and sleeping very well, too. And I think that's one of our problems. I don't think we're getting enough sleep, and I think we're eating poorly, because we're too busy. The other would be the breakdown of the family. In general, God gives grace when this has to happen. And if you press into and you're part of a church family, God can make all sorts of gaps fill in. But the breakdown of the family has caused people to be raised in homes that were not the way that God created them to be. There is not the stability that God created. And like I said, if you're in a one-parent home, that doesn't mean God will not fill that gap, but it means God needs to fill that gap, right? And he will, but I think that's one of the reasons. And then the last one, and this is the one that we're going to focus on because it's in David's life strong, is and this might be counterintuitive, but I would say the failure to lament. The failure to lament. And by lament, I mean grieve, mourn, I think is a huge cause of depression in people's life. If you look up the word lament, it means a passionate expression of grief and sorrow. A passionate expression of grief and sorrow. And if we don't know how to passionately express our grief and sorrow, it will not mean that the grief and sorrow go away. Pretending that it doesn't exist will not get rid of it. It actually, what will happen is it will hide somewhere, and you might be very good at compartmentalizing this sort of thing. You might be an expert compartmentalizer, and you can take that grief and sorrow and you just tuck it away back there, and I never have to think about it. But there, it will grow, and it will seep into every part of your life. It will like stretch its tentacles into every single relationship that you have and every single day of your life in ways that you cannot even connect the dots, I believe. Because you're allowing this thing to fester, and because you don't allow God to do something with it, and you refuse to lament, to mourn this sort of thing, it will cause all sorts of problems. And I think as a society, we are not very good at mourning, at lamenting, at grieving. I think we're bad at it as a society, you know. And there's a reason why this biblical culture, these Hebrews did the sort of things that they did. And so today, we're going to talk about if you're going to put a name on the message, it would be David's lament, or the lament of David. What we know in the story is that Saul just died, okay? So in 2 Samuel, and we're going to come back to the lamenting thing first, but we're going to read the story, and then we'll come back to it. So what we know is that Saul is dead, Jonathan is dead, the whole army of the Israelites are dead. David has been off with his 600 men in Ziklag in the Philistine country, and he did not go into the battle with the Philistines, and he's back in the Philistine country, and his whole family and town got taken away, and then God brought him back to them. So there's all of this crazy stuff happening in David's life. And in the last chapter, we talked about King Saul, and last week was a retrospective on King Saul's life. And now this week, David finds out that the king is dead, okay? And that's where we're at. And so it happened, chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, verse 1, after the death of Saul, when David returned from striking down Amalek, that David stayed in Ziklag 2 days. And it happened on the third day that, look, a man was coming from camp, from Saul. His clothes were torn, and he had dirt on his face. And it happened when he came to David that he fell on the ground, and he paid homage to David, right? So this guy's running, he's kind of messed up, he's dirty, his clothes are torn. He sees David, and he falls down, right? And David said, well, where do you come from? And he said, well, I came from the camp of Israel. I got away. And David said, what happened? Tell me. And he said, the troops fled from the battle, and also many of the troops have fallen and died, and also Saul and Jonathan, his son, they're both dead. And I don't know if at this point in the story, this man that is bringing the report knows that David knows, but I strongly suspect that he does not know that I strongly suspect that he thinks that David does not know, which he doesn't. This is when he gets the information. So when he tells him that that's happened, it says, David said to the lad who was telling him, okay? So I believe at this point, David is looking at this guy, and he's thinking, I don't know, something's not right, so I'm going to keep on questioning him. And so he's, well, how do you know that Saul died and Jonathan, his son? How do you know that they're dead? And so the lad who was telling him said, well, I just chanced to be on Mount Gilboa, which is, we know last week, that is where Saul died. And look, Saul was leaning on his spear. And look, chariots and horsemen had overtaken him. So, first of all, he's an Amalekite. We're going to find that out in a minute. Amalekites don't just find themselves anywhere. There's this warring kind of like looking for a fight kind of people. And there's this giant battle happening. And we're supposed to believe that he was just taking the dog for a walk one day, and, well, I'll just go up Mount Gilboa, and I just happen to be on Mount Gilboa, and then all of a sudden, shucks, well, there's Saul dead with Jonathan. Boy, what are the chances that I took my walk to Gilboa today, right? And he's leaning on a spear. Well, so this is important too, because 2 weeks ago, last week, we read about the death of Saul, and we find out that Saul had been overtaken, probably wounded poorly, and then he asked his armor bearer to kill him, and he said, just put me out of my misery, and his armor bearer said, no, there's no way I'm doing that. There's no way I'm killing you. And so Saul falls on his sword, right? That's the narrative that we get about the death of Saul. Well, we're about ready to hear a different narrative here. And so he said, I come across him, and he's alive, and he turns, and he sees me, and I said, here I am, and he said, who are you? And I told Saul, he said, I'm an Amalekite. And he said, pray, stand over me and finish me off, for the fainting spell has seized me, for while life is still within me. And he's just kind of rambling, cutting off. So in this guy's story, and we just read what the truth was last week, but in this guy's story, he comes across Saul, and Saul is almost dead, and Saul pleads with him and says, kill me. And I stood over him, and I finished him off, for I knew that he could not live after having fallen. Right? Which seems like that's maybe a mercy, right? Well, he's going to die anyway. It'd be better if I just killed him, because if the Philistines capture him, who knows what's going to torture they're going to put him through. So I took the crown that was on his head, and I took the band that was on his arm, and I brought him here to you, my Lord, he says. And he's calling David my Lord. This guy is calculating. I'm convinced of it. He knows exactly what he's doing. This is my strong opinion that I think a lot of people agree with me. This guy came across the dead body of Saul, saw the crown, saw the band around his arm, because he was not killed by Philistines, so the Philistines wouldn't have taken him right away, and thought, I have an opportunity here. Saul is the king. I know that Saul and David don't get along, and I know that David fashions himself a king, and that he might be the next king. I can get in good with David. I'm going to bring him the crown. I'm going to bring him this band around the arm, the proof of life or of death of Saul. And I'm going to tell him that I'm the one that killed him, because he's not thinking like David thinks. He's thinking like a warrior would think. And he's thinking, David wants the throne. Saul had the throne. I'm the guy that killed Saul. Here's the crown. So you can just go ahead and give me my promotion or my whatever now, because I just did you a favor. This is calculating. He knows exactly what he's doing. I'm convinced of it. And he's trying to make something happen. And the debate that I've read is, the question is, what does David know? Because David seems to be asking questions. And well, let's read what happened. So he said he finished him off, and that he brought the crown and the armband. And David took a hold of his garments, and he tore them. And the men who were with him did so too. And they wept and they fasted till evening for Saul and Jonathan, his son, for the Lord's people, for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the lad who was with him, hey, where are you from? And he said, I'm the son of an Amalekite sojourner. That's who I am. And David said, how were you not afraid to reach out your hand and do violence to the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the lads who was with him, and he said, come forward and stab him. And he struck him down, and he died. And David said, your blood is on your own head, for out of your mouth you bore witness against, saying that I was the one who finished off the Lord's anointed. So David seems to say, it looks like on the face of it, it looks like on this story that David kills the guy because he's the one that put Saul out of his misery. And like I said, on the face of it, if you didn't have the background, you would think, oh, it seems kind of tough on David to do that. But I believe, I'm convinced, and it doesn't really matter that much to the whole plot of the story, but I think David knew. I think David had a really good idea that this guy's story was not adding up. I think he looked into his eyes and said, this guy wants something from me, and he's making this whole thing up. And so David puts him out, because this guy he's only trying to use David to become something, right? So David then sings a lament for Saul and for Jonathan. And he said, not only is he going to sing this lament and everyone's going to hear it, but he looks at everyone and he's like, I want you to teach this to everyone. I want everyone to learn this lament, and I want everyone to know it. And it says that it was also found in the book of Jasher. We don't have the book of Jasher anymore. It has been lost to history. Maybe someday someone like Indiana Jones will be in a cave somewhere and find it. But as of now, we don't have the book of Jasher. But it's mentioned a couple different times. It seems to be the collected history, specifically probably poetic history of Israel. I really wish we did have it, but we don't. But we know that this poem was so important, that this song was so important that they put it in that book. And so I'm just going to read David's song. The splendor, O Lord, on your heights lies slain. How have the warriors fallen? Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in Ashkelon's streets, lest the Philistine daughters rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised gloat. O hills of Gilboa, no dew, and no rain upon you, O lofty fields, for there the warrior's shield was besmirched. The shield of Saul, unburnished with oil from the blood of the slain, from the warrior's fat. Jonathan's bow did not retreat, and the sword of Saul never turned away empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and dear, in their life and in their death, they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and bangles, who studded your garments with jewelry of gold. How have the warriors fallen in the midst of battle? Jonathan upon your heights is slain. I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. Very dear you were to me. More wondrous your love to me than the love of women. How have the warriors fallen and the gear of battle lost? It is a sad song. It's a lament is what it is. And first of all, before we get into the power of lamentation, I want to note the honor that David shows Saul here. He does not have to do this. Saul has been trying to kill him. Saul has not been his friend. Almost anyone else in the same circumstance would gloat, would say, you know what? Saul tried to kill me multiple times. I was only good to him. I was there for him. He died. He got what he had coming. That's what I think most people would have done in David's situation. But David is compassionate towards Saul. I think, personally, I think it's connected to the Spirit of God. I think what happened is that, well, what we know is there's a psalm where David says, take not your Holy Spirit from me. After he sins with Bathsheba, he says, Lord, don't take your Holy Spirit from me. I think David had a real sense of the difference between life with and without the Holy Spirit. And it says that when David was anointed king, that the Spirit of God was lifted from Saul. And so at that moment, when David is a boy, 20 years before he'd ever sit on the throne, I believe is when this transfer happens and the Spirit of God now rests on David in a way that it was resting on Saul. And what happens after that to Saul? Saul starts to go into fits of rage, right? And so when he's in these fits of rage, King Saul's, kind of inner circle says, we got to find a way to calm him down. Find someone who can play the lyre and sing some songs and bring him in here. And lo and behold, who is it? It's David. And whenever David plays, the fit leaves Saul and he calms down again. Is it because David was just like Eric Clapton good on the lyre? Is that, I think he probably was Eric Clapton good on the lyre. I don't know. But I don't think that's why. I think it's because he brought the Spirit of God into that place. And Saul remembered what it was like. And the peace of God would fill the place. And I think David saw it. And he thought to himself, boy, without God, I'm no better. I could not be a better king than Saul. And I think he was keenly aware of the struggle that Saul went through. I am not a perfect, by far, I am not a perfect leader or a perfect pastor. I would never claim to be. I don't even know sometimes if I'm very good at it at all. But I will say that I have learned to not be as critical as I used to be now that I'm sitting in that seat of leadership. It was just so easy for me to be critical before. And now I'm just like, yeah, it's not easy sometimes. And what am I doing? I'm pastoring a small church in Marion, Ohio. How hard is that? I don't know. Maybe it's really hard. Maybe it's not. But Saul, the amount of responsibility on him was monumental. And David sees it and says, ugh. And he mourns for Saul. He loved Saul. He loved Jonathan. He cared for these people. And I just think as a society, I just wonder if we're just lacking honor as a society. Just not only honoring those in authority over us, but just honor, period. Jesus shows up in his hometown. And it says, this is an insane thing to say, that Jesus could do no mighty work there. Why? It was because they didn't honor him. right? It was their lack of belief in him, but what it comes down to is their lack of honor for Jesus. And in Mark, that happens, and then the very next thing that happens is that Jesus honors the 12 by sending them out, and they start to do miracles everywhere. I think that's connected. And I think David, one of the reasons why David is a man after God's own heart is because he understood honor. And he always looked at Saul as the Lord's anointed. And he said, I know that I've been anointed king, but that's not my job to take that from Saul. God will take it from him whenever God takes it from him, but that's not my job. And until then, it's my job to honor him, even though he's trying to kill me, even though he's a really wicked leader in a lot of ways. It's really, really, I think, extremely important. And then we get to this idea of lament, the power of lament. In his book on the life of David, Eugene Peterson reflects on this, and he says this. I'm going to read a couple parts from it. He says, the one virtually foolproof way of getting noticed in our culture is to do something bad. The worse the act, the higher the profile. In the wake of whatever has gone wrong or whatever wrong has been done, commentators gossip, reporters interview, editors pontificate, Pharisees moralize, then psychological analysis are conducted, political reforms initiated, and academic studies funded. But there's not one line of lament. There's no lament because truth isn't taken seriously. Love isn't taken seriously. Human life doesn't matter as life. God-given, Christ-redeemed, Spirit-blessed life. It only counts as news. There's no dignity in any of it. It's only trivialized. And then later he says, and there's a lot more that you could read. He says, pain is not the worst thing. Being hated is not the worst thing. Being separated from the one you love is not the worst thing. Death is not the worst thing. The worst thing is failing to deal with reality and becoming disconnected from what is actual. The worst thing is trivializing the honorable, desecrating the sacred. What I do with my grief affects the way that you handle your grief. Together we form a community that deals with death and other loss in the context of God's sovereignty, which is expressed finally in resurrection. Obviously, what we must never do is get over it as soon as possible or make as little of it as we can. Quote, get over it and, quote, make little of it are unbiblical and inhuman. Denial and distraction are the standard over-the-counter prescriptions of our culture for dealing with loss. In combination, they virtually destroy the spiritual health of our culture. The societal effect is widespread addiction and depression. One more thing. If we're not taught to lament with this lamentation that we just read, we'll grow up believing that our immediate feelings determine our fate. If we're not taught to lament with this lamentation, we'll grow up believing that our immediate feelings determine our fate. We'll deny every rejection and thereby be controlled by rejection. We'll avoid every frustration and thereby be diminished by frustration. Year by year, as we deny and avoid the pains and losses, the rejections and frustrations will become less and less trivial and trivializing, empty shells with smiley faces painted on them. I believe that in order to live totally and completely the way that God wants us to, we have to literally, totally, and completely look death in the face and deal with it. And we grieve over not just death. Sometimes we grieve over loss of a relationship. We grieve over pain that has been inflicted on someone. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, this obsession with evil in the world and murder and rape and all of these horrible things, it doesn't feel like we're lamenting it. It feels like we're celebrating it. At the very least, we're glorifying it. And I don't think we're lamenting. And I think a refusal to lament, and I know what it's like. I mean, I have lived a fairly charmed life. My life has not been horrible, but I've had a couple of pretty serious blows in my life. And I found out that if I bury things, I'm going to explode, and it's not going to be pretty. A couple things happened. My mom died in 2014, December. And then our good friend, who many of you met, Rachel, died suddenly in a car accident, 2018. And I'm pretty good at compartmentalizing. Like, I'm pretty good at it. I was an actor, no big deal, in high school. I won a couple competitions, went to nationals, whatever. I got some trophies. But I'm pretty good at compartmentalizing. I can be thinking one thing. This is why I love Erica, because she's the worst at compartmentalizing. She's no good at it. You cannot hide. You know what I mean? She can't hide what she feels, and I love that. I need to be around more people like that. I don't want to be around people like me that I'm just guessing. I have no idea what you're thinking. I'm pretty good at it. And then one day I'm sitting at my house by myself, and a thought hit me about something else completely, and it was a very unhealthy thought. I was in my own way, I was almost wishing that someone would die. Like, I literally, the thought entered my mind. And I thought to myself, that's not, this is bad. And so I found a really great Christian counselor, and for about a year and a half, every month, sometimes twice a month, I went and I sat down with this guy, and he helped me work through it. And on the other side of it, I was able to sit there in his office and cry about things and complain about things. And he gave me some good wisdom, and I worked through it. Now, I mean, things still hurt. I wish that those things hadn't happened. But all of that was a result, I believe, in my emotional immaturity. And it's because I didn't know how to lament. I didn't know how to grieve. And grief is a gift that God gives us. Jesus was a wonderful lamenter. He was very good at it. Now, the thing about Jesus is, because he's God and he's all-knowing, we reactively lament. Something happens that we didn't expect, and we mourn over it. Jesus knew everything that was going to happen. So he kind of like proactively laments, like before the thing happens, which is a really interesting thing. In Luke 19, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, and he mourns over it because he knows a couple of things. First of all, who he is, what they're about ready to do for him or to him. And he knows that even then further, and in the lamentation, he prophesies that Jerusalem's going to be, there's not going to be a stone unturned. This whole thing is getting leveled to the ground. And many decades later, 70 AD, that happened. And it was, as they say, sacked. I mean, the whole city of Jerusalem. And Jesus cries and laments over it. Jesus also shows up at Lazarus' grave and cries. Jesus wept, right? This is like a mystery. Why did Jesus cry? He knew he was going to raise him from the dead. What's with the crying? And it says he groaned out loud. Like, we don't even know how to translate whatever he did. Some people say it's the Greek word that they used was the word that when a horse snorts, like it's angry, that's the word they used for Jesus when he shows up. He got angry and sad when he sees all of this. And what does he see? He sees death. He sees the devastation that it causes. And he's thinking, I'm going to put an end to this. But this is not good. And he weeps. Then later in the garden, he goes to the garden, and he's got 12 guys that have stuck with him through thick and thin. Everybody else has left him pretty much, but he has 12 close companions, and we know that there were some women in there too, but they don't get counted in the 12. But so there were at least 12, probably, let's say 20 or so people, who knows, that were just thick with him. I mean, just tight with Jesus. And he's about ready to go to the cross. And he wants to go to the garden, as was his custom. This is not the first time he ever went there to pray. And he's like, guys, would you pray with me? I'm about ready to hit the hardest part of my life. I've been looking at this down the road, and I've been knowing it's coming, and I don't know if I have the strength to face it. I want you to pray with me. And then what happens? He turns around, and they're gone. And he's like, yep, they're going to leave me too. They're about ready to give up on me completely. And he weeps, he mourns, he laments over this. And Jesus is really good at it. And actually, I think David was tapping into it. Well, I don't think so. I mean, it's obvious as the nose on your face. In Psalm chapter 22, so if you have your Bible, turn to Psalm 22. This is what you would call a messianic, prophetic psalm, where David, yes, wrote it, but it is prophetic about Jesus. And this is what Jesus says on the cross. The first line is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear me. And in the night season, I'm not silent. But you are holy, enthroned in the praises of Israel. The fathers trusted in you. They trusted. You delivered them. They cried to you, and they were delivered. They trusted in you, and they weren't ashamed. But I'm a worm. No man, a reproach of men, and despised by all the people. All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip. They shake the head, saying, he trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. I mean, this is a retelling. You can, later he says, dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed on me. They've pierced my hands and my feet. I can count the bones on my body. They look and they stare at me. They divide my garments among them. And for my clothing, they cast lots. I mean, you don't have to know too much about the story of Jesus to know that this is just like beat for beat what happened to Jesus on the cross. And this is a view into Jesus. He knew how to lament. And I am convinced that our inability to do this is causing a lot of depression, because it's like we've suffered loss. Everyone suffered loss. And if you don't know how to deal with it, and like I said, I don't think our society is good at it. I've mentioned this before, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, so don't be offended. But I, as a pastor, when people die, I'm asked to do funerals, right? That sort of thing happens. And more, I'm having people tell me, we don't want a funeral, we want a celebration of life. And I'm about ready to start saying no, because I'm like, no, you need a funeral. You need to grieve because you just lost something. And just to act like everything's okay and to pretend like, oh, everything's fine, and let's just not cry about it. Let's not, because it makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to cry. I don't want anyone to see me cry. I don't want to grieve. I don't want to be everything's good, and let's just. And no, it doesn't mean we can't celebrate the life, because I think we've got this whole mixed up idea about grief, like somehow thankfulness and grief cannot exist in the same space. But if you've ever been to a good funeral, you know that that's the best place for both of those things. We were at Rachel's funeral in Virginia. It was full of thankfulness for the life that she lived, and thankful that, boy, I got to know her, and she got to be an influence in my kids' life. And boy, I'm so thankful that God created someone like that. But I'm so deeply grieved by it too. And I don't have all the answers, but I know that somehow we got to get back to this idea of lamentation. We got to get back to understanding what it means to grieve. And own it when it happens. It doesn't, and the whole reason that we do it is not so that we can stay there, it's so that we can move through it. Because it is when we move through it that we get on the other side of it. And then when we get on the other side of it, it doesn't mean that we are glad those things happened, but it means that God, it was the healing balm that we needed to get through it. It's what God has given us, is grief, in order to get through these things. And you say, well, I'll never get through it, I'll never get over it. Okay, maybe. I know every situation is different, and some things are harder than others, and some people are more emotionally equipped. But I know that if you refuse to lament, then it's going to be hard. I just finished reading a book, and I finished it on Monday, and I closed it, and I told Eric about it. She was like, I'm not reading that book. It's a story about a guy who, his wife died, and he ended up being friends with C.S. Lewis, and it's like their writings back and forth, and it's a sad story. And in the end, I'm reading this poem because him and his wife had a dog together for, they had been married for 12 years before she died, and the dog, when it's like 17 years old, dies, and they had this dog together, and it's part of their story. And when the dog dies, because the guy's a poet, he writes a poem about the dog, and I'm reading this poem about a dead dog, and I'm crying. Like, what is wrong with me? I'm not sentimental about animals like that. But why? It's because we were made to do that, because we're supposed to do that. When something bad happens, we are recognizing this is not right. And to act like it is not helpful to anybody. We look at it, we say, this is wrong, God. This is wrong. And we ought to say that. This is a poem written by a man who survived World War I. We who are left, how shall we look again happily on the sun or feel the rain without remembering how they who went ungrudgingly and spent their lives for us too loved the sun and the rain? A bird among the rain wet lilac sings, but we, how shall we turn to little things and listen to the birds and winds and streams made holy by their dreams, nor feel the heartbreak in the heart of things? How can I enjoy the sun and the moon and the rain and the whatever when these people can't enjoy it anymore? And I remember feeling like that. Like, everything's gonna be dark forever. But as I prayed through it and I allowed God to speak to me, I realized that these people that I love, that I lost, that I cannot be with them while I'm on this earth. But if I could, they would tell me, go out and make a difference. Go out and love people. Go out, enjoy the rain, enjoy the birds, enjoy the sunset. Live it up.